Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to this FCI webinar. We've got people joining now, I can see. Thank you all for joining. There's just a quick bit of housekeeping I'm going to do at the beginning, and I'll hand over. Hopefully you can see that on your screen. If you could keep yourselves muted until the kind of Q&A discussion at the end, that would be great. You can use the links on your toolbar there, or there's some keyboard shortcuts. Do let us know any questions you have during the presentation and discussion in the Q&A, sorry, in the chat function. And you can also put your hands up towards the end of the discussion. We are recording the webinar currently, and it'll be up afterwards on the FCI website. And yeah, I think that's everything. And yeah, Marcus, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, hi. So can you hear me okay?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Inadvertently muted myself or anything. I'm going to share my desktop and you should be able to see my presentation. Well, welcome to the webinar. I was asked to present this webinar or chair this webinar with a panel after some discussions of clinical safety issues that have been fixed recently in GP systems and some of the considerations around that. And it became apparent that in that discussion there was probably some areas where there's a little bit of work needed to try and make the process a bit easier. I agreed. I'm not an expert in clinical safety. I'm not a trained clinical safety officer. I'm just a user with a bit of informatics experience, but that didn't necessarily help me in reporting my issue, which is kind of part of the reason we're here. So one of the things that I'd like, if we just go on to the aims of today's webinar, really what I thought really needs to happen is to start a conversation about clinical safety and how an everyday user would report those clinical safety issues that they find. And in the process of doing so, we would reflect on what happens currently across the 4 nations of the UK, which it has very different setup depending on which nation you're in. And learn from these existing mechanisms what exactly is already in place, and then sort of look at where the gaps are, and if there's anything that specifically needs to be improved, then how would we like this to look in the future, and can the FCI be instrumental in making that change happen? So I'll introduce our panel today. So I'm Marcus Baw. I'm a GP. I'm an emergency physician as well. I'm based up in Yorkshire. I'm the chair of the RCGP Health Informatics Group, and I'm a FCI Fellow. I develop software as well as a sort of sideline. So what I'm going to do is let our panel kind of introduce themselves and maybe say a little paragraph about their experience and anything that they think that they would like to bring to the discussion today, any perspectives regarding this sort of thing. So if we go to Lesley Kay.
So I'm Lesley Kay. I guess my main role here is I'm a prescriber who makes errors and who identifies difficulties in systems. So that's probably my key input. I am a member of the Faculty of Clinical Informatics, and I have done the training to be a clinical safety officer. My other role is I'm Deputy Medical Director at the Healthcare Safety Investigation Branch. Some of you may be familiar with us. We're an England only arm's length body in the NHS. We are working towards independence as soon as we get legislation. And our role is that we identify safety risks in the healthcare system, we undertake investigations, publish reports and make national recommendations for improvement.
Thanks, Lesley. Emma Melhuish.
Yeah, hi, my name is Emma Melhuish. I'm a pharmacist and I'm also an informatics specialist working at NHS Digital. I work on DM&D, which is the NHS Drug Dictionary, and also the SNOMED UK Drug Extension, and I'm a member of the Faculty of Informatics.
Thanks, Emma. Ian Thompson.
Hello, my name is Ian Thompson. I'm a GP in a rural part of Scotland in East Lothian, where I practice in a building opposite the headquarters of Minecraft in Scotland, small claim to fame. I'm also a clinical lead in primary care, digital health and care at Scottish Government. And for many years, I've been a part of our GPIT Change Advisory Board in Scotland that handles incidents and issues with GP suppliers in Scotland. I was previously the chair of the emergency care summary system in Scotland, but I've handed that on. That's equivalent to summary care record in England. And as a consequence of that, I was trained as a clinical safety officer because basically I was having to make clinical safety decisions. So I'm here to bring a perspective from a different nation that might have different ways of managing some of these things.
And Neil Watson.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, Neil Watson. I'm the Director of Pharmacy in Newcastle. Bit of a long-standing interest in informatics, really since turn of 2000, actually. But then was lucky enough to be involved in a EPMA implementation from 2008 within Newcastle, and therefore been working with a continuing maturing system since then. Particular interest in the safety impact of electronic prescribing, but of course that safety impact goes beyond electronic prescribing once you start getting into such things, and design becomes really important. And also a founding fellow of the faculty.
Okay, thanks everybody. So I'm going to move on to talking about a specific clinical safety issue. This is one that I reported, but what I'm kind of aiming for really is for this just to be a catalyst for the discussion, give us some kind of concrete focus. But actually, I think the issues we need to be talking about are much wider, much more about the national surveillance of all the issues. So I wouldn't want to get bogged down in the specifics of this one, but I just thought it was an illustration that I would bring to the table. So this is about 18 months ago. I noticed that a couple of times I had prescribed something in a GP system. I'm sure people who've seen GP systems will be able to tell which one, but I'm not going to name and shame. In this particular instance, there is an auto-correct feature in the dose directions box, and in fact, this feature only applies to the dose direction box. Arguably, the most safety critical box of any kind in a GP system, and it replaces certain bits of text, which is intended to help you. So it will replace things like BD with to be taken twice a day. So fair enough. What it also does is replace the hyphen character, or more accurately, if you type a space and then a hyphen and then a space, it will correct that to the word or. Now, in the two examples that I've given as screenshots there, what originally was typed was a hyphen, and then it was auto-corrected by the system to an or, and in doing so, changed the actual prescription. So what had been prescribed there was quite a complicated set of instructions in the first example for some pre-operative antibiotics for a child who was having urinary tract instrumentation, and that was changed to take this dose twice daily or start on the day before, which created confusion and resulted in a complaint actually. And the second example, not quite so dramatic, but take 1 to 8 sachets per day. So using the hyphen as a kind of interpolation character, which I think is fairly common, got changed to take 1 or 8 sachets per day, which is a very different dose direction. So I reported this. In fact, I was a little nervous about reporting it because I thought it's the kind of thing that people are going to say, well, that's just a feature that you're misusing. So I discussed it with some colleagues in the Health Informatics Group, and we were all fairly sure, having had that discussion, that it was an issue. And that gave me the confidence to go and report it to the system supplier. I was then told that I had to go and report it to the local help desk in order to get a special code or a ticket number that I would then use later in the process. And I was asked to email the ticket number to various people. I was also asked some of the early responses that I got were quite, I guess, patronising. They were kind of along the lines of, no one else has said this is a problem, and it's been there for a long time, this feature, so it's probably you, isn't it? It's probably you that's a problem. So I felt a little bit undermined by that, but buoyed up by the confidence given to me by my colleagues in HIG, I went forward and I raised it even further. I actually went to a colleague who I know who works for NHS Digital in their clinical safety team. And by a process of sort of attacking it at the bottom via help desk, in the middle via the system supplier, and at the top with NHS Digital, eventually the message all got joined up and it did get fixed. And about 3-4 weeks later, not a long time, the solution was fixed, or the issue was fixed, and they removed this autocorrect along with a couple of others that were also semantically odd, that would have been unpredictable to an average user or idiosyncratic. So great, we got this one thing fixed, but the process, if I was to reflect on that process, it was a bit less easy than I would have expected, and I'm a fairly adept informatician. I understand software. I've been a GP for quite a while, and yet it was not obvious to me how best to report the issue. And in fact, without using some informatics context, either the HIG for giving me the confidence to go and report it and not be knocked back by the first few bits of feedback, but also contacting NHS Digital, I don't think the issue would have been acted on, certainly not quite so rapidly, and it might have taken longer. But I also had to report the thing multiple times via emails, help desk, and so I was, as an end user, I was doing all that legwork, as it were. The issue reporting systems that I was asked to use didn't really let me use modern tools like taking screenshots or sending video. I was told that I was the first to complain, and it's been like this for X years. And also, stepping back from the process, all that effort was required to fix one issue, and we might have tens of thousands potentially of issues with software across all of the software systems being used in NHS across the 4 nations of the UK. So that means that there are too many issues for this to be something that requires huge amounts of personal effort on an individual basis. And in fact, nothing other than a distributed sort of all clinical staff surveillance response would be effective. And the other thing is I didn't receive any progress reports during that reporting process. So that's kind of a little vignette of me reporting something and how it felt. So really now what I wanted to do is bring in the panel and get their perspectives on this. And also then we'll open it wider to the webinar participants, and we can all discuss this issue. And as I said at the beginning, let's see where we can get in the time we have. So I'll go right on to the discussion. So who wants to come in from the panel? Ian's got his hand up.
Thanks, Marcus. I hesitate to jump in, but there seem to be few others volunteering, so I'll stick my head above the parapet as ever. There's an interesting perspective from Scotland in this, in that we've built since about 2012, when our current GP contract came into position with the suppliers, we've built a change advisory board which handles both scheduled changes and issues on a national basis. So there's one point of contact for the suppliers in terms of managing these sorts of problems. One of the things that we've had throughout that progress have been what are called GMS facilitators. So they're like the local eHealth desk, eHealth team, but they're specifically dedicated team who are there to support practices in terms of using their GP clinical systems. And part of the process around people picking up problems has been using these people to check that it isn't just a training issue, or more to the point, that the supplier isn't just turning around and saying it's a training issue, that actually it is a training issue or it isn't a training issue. So that helps to filter out some of the potential problems, but also it means that if it's then been confirmed by that person and perhaps checked on a lot of health boards have their own standalone testing systems that we can see if it can be reproduced there. Things are then escalated through the facilitator network to the GPIT Change Advisory Board. Again, we've got a dedicated tester with dedicated test systems for the two suppliers that we've got, so we can get it tested there. If they can reproduce it, we can definitely lob it back at the supplier. We do suffer from the similar challenge that you have of, well, it needs to be reported to the local eHealth help desk and it needs to be reported to the supplier's help desk, and we need to make sure that we join up the relevant tickets. But having done that, and then from my own perspective, having done that and then passed the ticket numbers on to the GPIT Change Advisory Board, it has resulted in it being included in weekly calls with the suppliers around getting it fixed. So, you know, it looks like, I'm not trying to blow Scotland's trumpet because we have definitely got some problems with our systems, but that does look like we've got some benefits. One of the subgroups we've got as part of our GP Change Advisory Board is a prescribing advisory board, which brings in both primary and secondary care pharmacists, as well as GPs with a special interest in this, to discuss prescribing specific issues. So we have had some things around shellfish allergies not flagging in some of our suppliers. We've also had challenges with double-barreled names and these sorts of things. I think my perspective is when we find a problem in Scotland, often it's then difficult to see, is it a problem elsewhere in the UK, because systems are different elsewhere in the UK. And one of my concerns is there isn't any UK-wide mechanism for saying, hey guys, we've got a problem with this. Is that also a problem for you? So that we share the knowledge and the learning that we might have around fixing some of these.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. I would agree. It's well, it certainly sounds like you've got some things fixed in Scotland, but there's a definitely sort of UK-wide gap there that we're not sharing between, you know, Northern Ireland, Wales, and England. Anyone else from the panel? Neil.
Thanks, Marcus. Yeah, I mean, it's probably helpful just to kind of echo actually what we've just heard, actually, so that it keeps it maybe parochial at the moment, and then we can think about the wider ramifications thereafter. So certainly, we've got a local system which allows people to feed in exactly as you did, to say we've got an issue, we've identified something that seems to be not quite right, and then the process we go through, which I suspect is what would be echoed in lots of parts of the system, and I'm sure we'll come on to the entry point, which is the difficulty that you had, is hitting somebody that recognises that there may be a problem, and then what they would then do is I'd expect them to triage that and think about, actually, is this clinically very significant, or is this something that perhaps just needs some refining over time? And if it's significant, how readily can it be fixed? Because the sort of issue I think you described, I'd expect something like that to be immediately recognised as having fairly significant issue. You know, as a pharmacist, hearing that you could have a dose of 1 or 8 sachets a day is slightly concerning. So I'd hope that would have piqued a little bit of interest. And actually, that sort of thing, if fixed, I'd expect that to be fixed within the day, to be honest. And then, of course, beyond that, you get into the realms of, well, is this a very local configuration issue? Is this something that just affects us in the way that we built it ourselves? Or is this a system issue, that the design of the total system, and is therefore likely to be impacting others? And if it's impacting on others, then we would expect to escalate that to interest groups for that specific system and begin to share that more widely. The issue is whether or not that is systematic enough, or whether it's a little bit chance, and I suspect there's maybe quite a bit of chance in that, which we need to do something about.
Lesley?
So I've just been joined by the cat, who's anxious to participate. So I think it's interesting that you're reported as the first person to spot that error, Marcus, because does that mean that you were just more vigilant, that you noticed it? The other type of people who are likely to pick up these errors are going to be the pharmacists and indeed the patients. And I think we know from the Cumberledge report that if we think the system's opaque for getting answers, then the patients struggle even more. And some of these incidents will lead to harm that may not be appreciated. So I think any solutions we come up with need to think of all the people who might be identifying and reporting these kind of problems. I think the second thing I would say is that one of my interests from the HSIB is making sure that this information is joined up at the other end so that the learning can come out of it. So it's one thing to fix a system, and it's one thing for the suppliers and the digital end, if you like, to be able to join that up. But actually, lessons learned on prescribing may also apply to other aspects of healthcare. So where is this information going? So in England, the kind of overarching body who looks at things would be the patient safety team for NHS England and Improvement. And how are we joining up these messages that come through different routes, I think is something I would think is very important, and to make sure that somebody is having an overview of that. And just the third thing I'd like to say, again with my safety science and human factors head on, is that we need to be looking at the right kind of solutions. So coming back to you and saying, well, no one else has reported it. I think we're all pretty much inclined to feel that we've made mistakes, it's our fault, it's an individual error. And if you look at most trust incident report investigation of all these sorts of things, they recommend more training, more counselling, beating people until they behave better. We know that's a very weak barrier, and we know that if you start the hierarchy of interventions, you start with engineering the system with forcing functions, you start standardising. So I think that's my third point, really. We need to make sure we respond with the appropriate solutions.
Thanks. I think one of the things that from that just made me think that we aren't very good at sort of collating this stuff when there are multiple users reporting a similar thing, for example. So in your first point, where it was was I genuinely the first person to report that? I suspect probably not. I would imagine that this has been reported on and off, but just no one's managed to push it to completion, as it were, because if you were rebuffed at early stages by either the local help desk or by discussions in a user group, for example, if that undermines your confidence to be able to assert that this is a genuine clinical problem, then you'll stop and you'll be dissuaded. And so I just wonder if it's been reported, maybe it's been reported dozens of times. And that's one thing that if we had better open reporting of issues, then something that's reported multiple times like that, it would eventually become obvious from a national viewpoint. You could say, well, this has now been reported in 20 different CCGs, whereas each CCG only sees it once. So that's what's important, to kind of be collating this stuff so that we can see the relative risk that's being run nationally. Ian.
I was just I've put in the chat some other examples that I've with a bit of searching through my now migrated Office 365 email. I managed to find, and they're actually from 2 years ago, and we did try and lob them across the border to England to the clinical safety offices in NHS Digital. I've yet to hear if anybody did anything about them, though we did get the methotrexate one sorted because that was escalated to MRHA. But there's a lovely example there for dose instructions for methotrexate, where we had a patient who was taking 6 tablets of methotrexate per week, one on each different day, because that's what the MRHA directions for methotrexate say. And we felt, my pharmacy colleagues felt that this was so much of an issue that I was pushed and cajoled, and well, it didn't take much pushing, but I was strongly encouraged to take this up nationally. The challenge was knowing where to take it, because of you know, it's actually a National Patient Safety Agency specification, and said agency no longer existed. To get the word once added into those instructions for all suppliers. And we'd had patient harm occur on multiple occasions, which, you know, one of the things we've been trying to do is apply the some of the NHS digital clinical safety approaches to this, in terms of scoring both the impact and likelihood of this occurring, to give us an overall hazard or risk score for what's happening. And obviously, as a trained clinical safety officer, that's often an approach I try and take. But trying to get these issues escalated is often challenging, particularly if the supplier says, well, the other UK nations don't have a problem with this.
That's the same as, well, no one else has complained, isn't it?
Yes.
Any other views from the panel before we go to the wider audience? Okay, so any views from the wider audience? By all means, just pop your hand up and we can bring you into the discussion. Richard Ellis Gibson.
Hi, yeah, it's just quite interested to hear an answer from some suppliers that, you know, this doesn't apply. We've never heard this from any other users. And I mean, you know, just speaking on behalf of Vision, the first thing we do is get all 4 countries of the UK to see if any, you know, what other practices are impacted by this, you know, in other countries aside from the practice who initially reported it. So I'm quite sad to hear that, actually, because that seems to be, you know, most of the, I know there's country-specific functionality, but most of the functionality in a GP system is actually used throughout the UK, not just in a particular country. So that's quite a revelation. Disappointing to hear that.
I think the problem might actually be even bigger in secondary care, where the systems are highly configured per trust. So whereas in primary care, we do really have 4 systems which largely do share functionality cross-border. So if you fix a system issue in Scotland, the fix will probably work in England. But I'm really lacking in confidence that the systems being used in secondary care will even genericize a fix from one trust to another trust, because I'm not completely convinced that, unless there is some massive issue, and bearing in mind that a lot of them don't have quite the same e-prescribing or electronic prescribing systems, but there must be clinical risk issues happening every day in trusts which probably don't get shared widely between systems, or at least we don't have the visibility to know whether that's happening or not. Anyone else from the audience want to come in? There was a brief flash of a hand then.
I think it might be Morgan. Yeah.
Morgan, Thanig Salam.
Yeah, so thanks. Yes, so from a secondary care perspective, I take the point about not all secondary care having electronic prescribing yet. We're just in the process of, at Sherwood Forest, of working with the supplier and another trust to develop a system. On the broader challenge, my experience and talking to colleagues, especially in secondary care, is that there's almost like a script for suppliers of when somebody flags an issue, which works through the process of nobody else is reporting it. We can't replicate it. It doesn't exist. You need to prove it exists before you take it seriously. And so on and so on and so on, until you get either too weary, or for those of us that don't quit, eventually get some acknowledgement and maybe a fix. Your point about it not necessarily being shared more widely, we tend to rely on informal networks, particularly user groups with individual suppliers, so that you can share the question and say, is this true? Has anyone of other people truly never seen this? and almost invariably you discover that it's a consistent problem. The issue again that comes to is, where do we take it? How do we deal with this fundamental issue? So who do we go to say we have a problem with the supplier where they're not supporting improvements to patient safety or user experience that impact upon patient safety? That there isn't a stick, and they're aware that, of course, we don't have an easy contract. Well, we can't just say, well, we'll go to a different supplier, because of course that kind of thing takes a long time. So we are in a bit of a weak position. I suspect that's not unique to secondary care. We are in a weak position at the moment because there is no real powerful motivator on the suppliers.
I think that's an interesting one. In primary care in England, we, in theory, are in quite a strong position because we buy all the systems centrally using the GPIT Futures framework. But I'm not aware of a mechanism for an issue once it's been identified. I don't think there is a mechanism for that learning to fold back into the GPIT Futures requirements. I think it's actually those processes for both those things do exist, but I'm not sure that they're linked in that way, that a known clinical safety problem that gets fixed would go into the requirements such that a new entrant wouldn't make that error. So that's an interesting one. Even in areas where we do have relative power in the market, I'm not sure that we're using it. Kerry Friends. Kerry, are you on mute, perhaps? Or is that Friends?
Yes, absolutely. I'm on mute. I apologise for that. Hi, it's Kerry here from. I do a lot of EPS testing, and certainly one of the issues that we found was the use of ON for at night. If you're using dosage instructions and you apply the patch on a different piece of skin or portion of skin, it actually translated it to at night. So that was one of the tests that we actually built in to the EPS testing, and I've made a note to add the hyphen and O test, so that whenever we're testing any prescribing systems for EPS, we will make sure there's a test for the dosage instructions to make sure it is translated correctly. So I would be grateful if you do have any more examples of these to make sure we can get the tests in.
Okay, so
in answer to your question, yes, sort of once someone is made aware, certainly at NHS Digital, then the tests, the next lot of tests are always a little bit more complicated than the first lot, and so on.
Yeah, well, it's good to hear that those tests are getting into NHS Digital. So Kerry, could you let us know a sort of entry point for that, how we would let you know, so that
certainly. Emma, do you have? I know Emma Melhuish very well. She has my email address. So if you want to send me Marcus's email address, then I can pass on some information.
I can put it in the presentation notes as well.
Oh,
so
right, thanks.
Who's looking at the
that'd
presentation
be great.
can get a link to ways of reporting this thing. So if we were to move from this sort of general discussion of the issues to maybe what would a better system look like if we wanted to engineer something so that the average user knew exactly how to report an issue and did so readily, and what would that process look like? Where should it be? Does anybody have any ideas on that? Peggy Edwards.
Hi, I'm Peggy Edwards, and I head up the clinical safety work and incident reporting in Wales. We have a system where everything goes through our local desk, and if it's a national contract, it comes to the national service desk, and it's filtered in that way, and we can then manage the contract. We're aware of the spread across the organisation. Sorry, my house phone's just going. Spread across the organisations. And also, as a clinical safety officer, I can then look at and say, we think that's a clinical issue. The example I've put in the chat, we had that you've only reported it once, and I went back and said, I'm sorry, if this happened in my system, I'd want to know how big and how bad. I want you to go and audit this. And they came back and there were 60,000 patients affected. So because, you know, we're at the size of a, you know, the old Special Health Authority in England, we do filter it all through that one service desk channel to get that overview. What we're not doing is sharing across the country.
Lesley, there's somebody else actually as well.
So I was mainly going to ask a question actually.
Okay.
So Stefan's put a comment in the chat about datix. Again, datix has its own reputation in trusts, but I think datix and its other brands are available, do feed into the National Reporting and Learning System. We know it's not much used in primary care, but there was a simplified form developed, I think in about 2014 for primary care, with the, I think, attempted carrot of CPD reflection if you do report. Why does datix not work, I think is my question for people.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, isn't it?
I mean, we've struggled with not having access to datix in Scotland, and as Peggy says, how long have you got? I think that the challenge here is often my thought would be the way it's configured at a local level doesn't enable people to make the right kind of report, and that the feedback that people get is such that they just don't bother, because you fill in a form and nothing happens, or you fill in a form and nobody pays any attention. And I think the key thing about being able to raise risks is having timely, relevant feedback on reporting these sorts of things. And clearly that link will only work in England.
Yeah, and I think if datix was working well, then it would be fairly universal. Everybody would be able to get onto it across all 4 nations, and it would be almost like a real-time system that at the top level you could actually see where all the issues were across all types of activity as well. So we're talking about IT systems, but I mean, in COVID crisis, you know, lack of PPE, for example, is being datixed, and being able to spot that in real time would actually be beneficial when you're managing a health service at either 10,000 feet level. So it's clear that there is a half a system kind of thing. We've got something there, but I think from my experiences of using datix, every trust that you work at has selected a slightly different choice of questions. So it doesn't necessarily mean they can be aggregated very easily at top level. And there are too many questions. Often, you know, they want you to do the risk analysis and the gridding of this for them. And whereas what this should be is much more like an aviation industry level sort of, something happened to my plane, and the investigation of that is for experts in that to take over. It's not for me to have to justify that it was an issue, offer an explanation, provide evidence that it definitely wasn't me or my incompetence. We need less push from the individual and more pull from the organisation. That would be my kind of view of how it should be. We've got some hands up. Let me just see.
I think Paul's got his hand up if you wanted to.
Hi, Marcus. Yeah, no, thanks. In some ways, apologies. I'm maybe just echoing what's said there. You know, we do have datix in Scotland, and interestingly, I've done, as well as a secondary care, I've done some of the aeromedical retrieval, Marcus. So I've spent a fair bit of time involved in the aviation side of it. So I think, in the question that Lesley asked, why is it not work really successfully? I think it's not transparent. It's not interoperable. The questions are all different. There's no feedback, and it relies on push, not pull, which is really just a summary of what you've all said. But I think these are the main points. That's been my experience. I would completely echo those as the reasons why it's not working. In terms of solving that dilemma, I suppose, do we start to take a view from the sort of if you imagine the perfect world in the sort of the medication industry, where they've got the sort of report to MHRA and they capture all the adverse events from drugs. I know that world's not perfect, and that's being looked at the moment by MHRA. But how do we better capture that on a UK-wide basis? And is that something that IT, sort of e-health software, should we be playing into that discussion?
I think it's possible that's the case. I had a look at the yellow card MHRA site just before we came on, actually, and there is, because they have a remit in managing medical devices, there is a area on the yellow card to report a medical device. However, a lot of our EPRs are not actually medical devices. They sort of sidestep it, or at least at the moment they are pretending to not be medical devices. But one of the things that struck me about the difference between yellow card and any other IT reporting is that some of the things that come back to you about reporting an IT issue would be akin to a drug manufacturer saying, if this drug caused you nausea, could it be that you were taking it wrong? Was the patient taking it right? That's the kind of pushback, the early pushback that a user would often get would be, you're not using the system right, and that's why you're getting a problem. And we don't have that response in pharmaceutical industry. We've actually, incredibly, managed to create a system where the pharmaceutical industry are not really able to gatekeep the reporting of issues with their drugs. Whereas in healthcare IT, we definitely do have a system where the system suppliers can gatekeep the reporting, because inevitably, if you have to go through a help desk that involves a supplier in any way, it's often the case that they will, like was mentioned before, there's a script of things that they will often say to the reporter. Well, are you sure you're not just using it wrong? No one else has said it, etc. So maybe we need to completely remove system suppliers from the initial response so that we're capturing everything, and then only once things have been captured and we're happy that that we've got surveillance on this stuff, then at that point we can involve the system suppliers. Obviously we have to in order to fix this stuff. But yeah, I wonder if that might be a way of improving the system. Peggy?
Yeah, I don't want to harp on about datix, but the trouble with those sorts of incident reporting systems, and I know I used to work for the NPSA, so I've worked on the NRLS and I've seen the information that comes through, and people report the incident. So in your case, the example you gave earlier is a medication error. They'll report that as a medication error. They won't report that necessarily as an IT issue. And to try and unpick where the IT is out of all these clinical incidents that are reported is really, really difficult. I mean, I used to pull the NRLS data every month to look, and I used to use strings and all sorts of things to try and get an understanding of what's happening out there with IT. And it's a useless tool at the moment, because you cannot marry that picture up. So it's about how we can use these systems far more intelligently to be able to, and that does require the user sometimes to say, oh, and this was an IT issue as well as a medication issue. So as much as you just want to put in, the thing's wrong, you do need some of that intelligence sometimes to do that analysis, to gain the lessons out of it.
Interesting. Yeah. I think whenever I've used datix, it's been unable to take anything other than text input as well. So I've thought one of the things that's absolutely helped me most whenever I've reported a clinical safety issue has been to take screenshots, because when you describe the problem, it's easily arguable either way. If you show the problem as a text, or even better, some video or something, that is incontrovertible.
Yeah, we do that through our service desk. We allow people to send screenshots. In fact, we ask them to send screenshots, because you know what it's like. You can't replicate the thing. So yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. Okay. Any other viewpoints? So I guess for the last 15 minutes, really, it'd be nice to sort of think about, well, what would we do as a Faculty of Clinical Informatics? We're all fellows, members, or associates, and we have a organisation which we belong to, which I guess from the outcome of this webinar, we think that there is a problem in terms of, at the very least, the national aggregation of some of these issues. So are there any thoughts about what we could do, what we should do, suggested approaches, suggested next steps for the organisation?
I think VJ was mentioning something in the chat. He's got his hand up as well.
Yeah, okay, VJ first, then Richard.
Hi all. Yeah, so it's in the chat. There's a really interesting conversation happening in the chat box, suggesting solutions to some of these things. And there's a real feeling that even datix themselves are a supplier. So it'd be really good if we could have a collated issues log that was independent of any supplier, ideally extending to all 4 nations. We could have issues ideally down to supplier software versioning. And that might be something that could be introduced at the national level. Part 1. The other thing I was going to mention, in secondary care environments, which is normally where I end up working, is the systems are usually not updated as frequently. At least in the GP world, you get EMIS pushing regular updates. System 1 normally gives you an update without even telling you. But on the actual secondary systems world, you'll find that it's a long time since you last took a version upgrade off a system, and the service response is often, yes, it's fixed in the next version. And then 6 months or a year down the line, when you get the next version, you find out it isn't fixed. So
yeah, that's not great. Richard?
Yes, it was just to say that in working for Vision, in the past we've had some clinical safety issues that have, impacted across all 4 nations. I mean, that tends to be the case anyway. That tends to be the norm rather than just being a issue. I found it useful to try and get the clinical safety.
So Richard, your vocal is kind of fading in and out there. I don't know if it's a microphone problem.
Is that better?
I can hear you now.
Yeah. Yeah, it was just to say, in the past, I have actually tried to kind of facilitate across UK meetings with the clinical safety groups across the 4 nations. So, you'd have the CSG from NHS Digital, you'd have the clinical safety advisory group from National Services Scotland, you'd have NWIS from Wales, and you'd have BSO from Northern Ireland. So quite often I've found that that's a good way to get a more objective view across, if you have a coordination view on something, on an issue. And it's quite often sort of speeds up the time where we can actually resolve these issues, rather than have to deal with the 4 nations separately and do the same thing 4 times. So I'm just suggesting maybe that's something to think about for the faculty, to have if we could have an all UK group from all 4 UK countries. Might be something to think about. I think as well, sometimes you get the subtleties, the country-specific subtleties about something that you maybe didn't consider in the country that reported it. So it's been quite a useful thing to do, certainly from a supplier perspective, to try and come to a quick resolution that fits all countries.
So possibly actually the FCI hosting some kind of 4-nation forum of clinical safety issues is what you're suggesting.
Yeah, possibly. As a not just as a think tank, but also as a kind of a way to proactively sort of manage issues.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah,
I know there's limitations to that as well. In terms of who's got time to do that, but I just think it's useful if you can get all countries involved in things rather than try and do things specific to each country.
You might be able to help on the issue of sort of commercial sensitivity that revolves around this kind of thing, because as you can imagine, these are systems, the suppliers are businesses, and if we were to have open reporting of bugs, I think there's a little bit of nervousness around that, because it feels like we'd be criticizing systems, and there's a legal issues. Is this defamation or some other kind of legally defined criticism?
I think that's always been the problem as well. People get nervous about this kind of stuff because it kind of puts them it leaves them open to that, But certainly as a maybe as a lessons learned exercise, even to try and look at historical issues and maybe not name suppliers, but just talk freely about them, and we can maybe share knowledge. Yeah, I do realise it is a difficult thing to do. People get a bit worried about sharing information with other suppliers, etc. It's something to consider, really.
And although interestingly, I did some work on clinical software usability, and we did a survey of usability. This is about 4 or 5 years ago, and we expected that digital health would get sued at some point by a supplier who had felt they'd been libelled. And actually, that wasn't the experience. All the suppliers were very happy to participate, and were quite pleased to have reviews. Even the ones that got bad reviews actually were fine about the idea that their usability was, reported as low. So maybe the fear of being sued for libel is out of proportion to the reality.
I think so. I think we've all got to remember why we're doing this as well. I mean, ultimately, it's to try and make patients' lives safer. So you need to have that at the forefront, I think, when you're discussing it.
A couple more hands up. So we've got Ian and then Paul, I think, in that order. I wasn't sure which order.
Thank you, Marcus, for letting me come back. I think I would pick up on Richard's point. I think it's very useful to have these 4 nations things. There is, to some extent, what grew out of the devolved nations GPIT forum, and now includes England, a discussion between some of the service managers. But I don't think that necessarily automatically includes highlighting the clinical safety issues. And again, that's just within primary care. And some of the issues that we're coming up with are issues that could apply, often they're prescribing issues, that could apply to some other non-primary care systems. And so it's important to try and elevate the learning that we might have from that. So I think I would support the concept of some sort of UK-wide approach to this, to at least record the issue, clearly resolving it, and perhaps recording which systems are affected is a little bit more sensitive. But on the whole, since this is about patient safety, I think there's a good argument to say that to balance the sort of alleged libel issue versus the are you willing to take responsibility for the patient harm that comes as a result of you deciding to do this, which I find is a very good argument for technological people who are perhaps getting in the way of what would seem to be a logical solution to a clinical safety problem, which we've used in a number of different fora recently. Emma will know some of them. We have a live one at the moment, which for sake of conciseness I won't mention, but could have a big impact on clinical email.
Paul Campbell next, and then Neil Watson, and then we're probably going to be out of time.
It's just very reflective on that comment, that thought of people are worried about reporting it, be it libel or something. And if you compare and contrast in the landscape of clinical safety, or in the landscape of any high reliability organisation where safety is paramount, to have a scenario that says, "Oh, but I'm too worried to report it," there's something not right about that. It strikes me. And I remember a year or so ago, was one of the big manufacturers, I believe, the other side of the pond, came out with statements. You're not allowed to take screenshots of my stuff, our software. It's commercially sensitive and all that sort of stuff. And that would be akin to, like, I go back to the pharmaceutical world saying, no, you can't possibly say anything bad about our drugs. And I just find it really quite discordant with the concept of safety. So I wonder if there's something within what comes out of the Cumberledge report about patient safety officer that may come from this, or whether there's a regulatory position we can get to that says that's an untenable position for manufacturers to hold. We should be able to say we think this is a safety concern. I don't know if the faculty could somehow work towards providing a consensus statement around that or something as a start point of that discussion.
That's interesting. There is safety in numbers where this is a concern, definitely. So if everybody sticks together, it's harder for everybody to be sued.
I'll stand beside you, Marcus.
And Neil Watson.
Yeah, thanks, Marcus. I mean, it strikes me from listening to examples that people have given and potential solutions that people have raised, and I've been sitting listening with lots of potential solutions in my head as well. I mean, we haven't mentioned medicine safety officers yet. I have to say I don't know whether that extends into Scotland or not, but certainly in secondary care in England, there are medicine safety officers in every organisation who are responsible for collating that sort of stuff locally, and they also share. But so that's just another example from me, and it strikes me that something that the faculty could be doing with all these examples that we've got. One of the things that we're all struggling with is really understanding what's out there, and whether we actually could just simply have some sort of mapping exercise that takes a stock of all the mechanisms that currently exist related to error reporting associated with medicines or digital, and then trying to see, once we've mapped that out, trying to understand either where the gaps are or how we can signpost people to the right way of getting things reported, fed back, and learnt from.
Thank you, Neil. I think that's been a really interesting exploration of the issue. We've brought up some good issues there. We're coming to the end of the time, so I think what I'll do is I'll try and sort of bring it to a close really at that point. I'm not going to try and sum it up because I think we've covered too many areas to kind of synopsize it. But what would be really useful actually perhaps is if we can bring some of this discussion to the faculty's discourse forum. So we've got a members forum. We also have an open forum. They're all part of the digital health networks. And that might enable us to sort of continue some of these discussions and perhaps even inform things like that mapping that we're talking about, because I think that is something that in preparation for this, as I was doing the slides, I was starting to things that were popping into my head of parts of the solution that already exist. But it's apparent that, for example, the HSIB, great, that's a part of the solution, but it only exists in England. And then we've got fragments of solutions existing in all the different devolved nations. And maybe if we could try and contribute out what we all know of the things that exist in our home nations, and we can try and make a grid, as it were, of what is where. That's something we can do collaboratively using discourse, and we can collect it all together there, and then perhaps it will be more obvious where the gaps are. So I think it's about time for me to just thank the panel. So thank you to all the panel who've contributed so well, and also to the attendees who've also contributed fantastically. It's been really interesting for me. I've learned a lot, and I think this is an interesting start point for a conversation, because there's a lot further we can take this, and I think there's much more the faculty can do, and we as the members can define that. So I think that's a good place to be. So thanks everyone, and thank you to the faculty team who've set up the webinar as well. And I guess that's probably all. I'll bring it to a close right about on time, 6 seconds left, so I'm quite happy. Okay. Thanks everyone, and
thank you.
Bye for now.
Thank you, Marcus.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thanks, Marcus.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.